because what's at stake here is not just the privacy of individuals, but our democracy and our free society as a whole. Have we found definitive, ultimate proof of who used Predator and why? No, we have not, and we will not find that proof as long as the authorities are not willing to share official information with us. So, we will have to deduct as much as we can from the context and the elements that we know so far, because we may not have all the pieces of the puzzle, but we have many, and the image is becoming clear. Predator has been used on targets in Greece, including on journalists and politicians. Some of those have also been the target of official surveillance by the EYP. But who is using Predator? We hear all kinds of wild speculation, most of which is utter nonsense. So I will discard those scenarios. There are basically two scenarios that are possible. One is it is Intellexa itself, for whatever reason, and the other one is that it was done by the government or actors in government circles. The question is then, who chose the targets and why? In detective terms, who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity? So let's first look at the victims that we know so far. First, journalist Koukakis, who is a real nuisance to the powers that be, as journalists are supposed to be. He writes about corruption and tax evasion, specifically the gentlemen Bitsios and Lavranos, and he also wrote about controversial new laws on, among other things, the banking sector. Then there's journalist Teloglu, who mercilessly exposes the spyware scandal. Malichoudis, another journalist who writes in international media about the treatment of migrants in Greece. Then we have a politician, Mr. Androulakis, who was, at the time that he was targeted, candidate for the PASOK leadership, and from the four candidates, I believe, the one who publicly declared that he would not support a coalition government led by Mr. Mitsotakis as Prime Minister. And then a recent case, or recent revelation, Mr. Spirtsis, who is close to Mr. Tsipras and who is also present during key meetings with the party leadership and third parties, so between the party leadership and third parties. So you can see, if I may paraphrase a movie title, 4 threats and an opportunity for the government party. Now, cui bono, as they say, who benefits? So let's look at some of the protagonists of the story. We've heard about Mr. Dimitriadis, Mr. Bitsios, and Mr. Lavranos, who all three have close business and personal connections. We've heard about Mr. Kondolion, the former EYP chief, who is also, by his own admission, socially acquainted with Mr. Dimitriadis. Then there's Mr. Bitsios and Lavranos, who benefited themselves from a new law from 2019 on freezing orders introduced by the new government, with the results that their frozen assets were released. Mr. Bitsios is also, or was until recently, 1/3 owner and manager at Intellexa, close to Tal Dilian and Mr. Stanislav Peltsar, former legal representative of Krikl. All three are also connected to Malta. Mr. Lavranos, who is most probably the ultimate beneficial owner of Krikl and has benefited, therefore, from the government contracts. Mr. Dimitriadis, who is also reportedly closely acquainted with Mr. Loverdos, who was formerly a minister, but who was also one of the candidates for the PASOK leadership, and he had been part of a former Nea Demokratia PASOK coalition. Now, as to means and opportunity, first of all, in 2019, the EYP was brought under the exclusive oversight of the Prime Minister, and Mr. Dimitriadis was responsible for it in his office. Then Mr. Kondolion was appointed by the new government, and that required a small change to the law, the statute. There was also a new head of the National Transparency Authority that was appointed, and at that time the previous government had actually abolished the true prosecutor authorization of surveillance requests. So that means that until the very recent change in law, that there was one prosecutor who was responsible for approving approximately 60 requests a day without knowing who the target was or what the reasons was for that person to be put under surveillance. I would call that not a meaningful judicial oversight, but a rubber stamping exercise. When the ADAE concluded that Mr. Koukakis had the right to be informed of the surveillance that he had been under, the government abolished the right of targets to be informed more quickly than I can say kratiki asfalia. National security is invoked to conceal the reasons for surveillance of Koukakis, Androulakis and others. A parliamentary inquiry was set up, as you know, but the government majority blocked the testimony of key figures such as Dimitriadis, Bitsios and Lavranos, who, by the way, also failed to answer to the invitation of this PEGA committee, and the conclusions and minutes will remain classified. The EYP files of Koukakis and Androulakis have very unfortunately accidentally been destroyed. There has been an investigation by the National Transparency Authority, but that was 2 months after the complaint of Mr. Koukakis, and what they did is they visited the premises of Intellexa in Krikel one time. I think they investigated 1 year of the annual accounts of the companies. They didn't investigate the subsidiaries, they didn't confiscate any servers or computers or administration, so I would call that a very superficial investigation. Using spyware, as far as I know, is a criminal offense. So one would then expect, if this has not been, the government can therefore not engage in it, so one would expect the authorities to engage in a very vigorous search for the culprit of such a serious crime. But I do not see that there is such a vigorous search for the culprit. On the contrary, most relevant information has been classified, and I also note that, as we have learned today, again, that both the Prime Minister and the Parliament could use their discretionary powers to lift that confidentiality. So the information that is currently classified could be shared, maybe even in a redacted form, but it could be shared, and we're not getting it. Then, on top of that, I note that journalists who have been writing about the spyware scandals have also been hit by massive slaps, notably by the same Mr. Dimitriadis that I mentioned earlier. Now, I like to make the comparison with a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. There are still 100 pieces missing, but you can see what the image is, and it's not pretty. And it doesn't point in the direction of the hypothesis of Intellexa being behind this, and it never made much sense. Everything is pointing in the direction of people in government circles, in any case, Mr. Dimitriadis and some of his associates. Now, if people say that is the wrong conclusion, then I would invite the authorities to share all the relevant information with us if they say that this hypothesis is the wrong one. Now, I do believe, and I come to the conclusion, that this matter must be urgently and fully clarified before next year's elections. And we have, as my colleague has just said, we're not just looking at Greece, but also Poland, where we've made the same remark. National elections are also European elections, because they also determine, for example, the representation of the governments in the Council. So therefore, they have to be free and fair. So every shadow of a doubt about interference has to be lifted before the elections. This is key. And really the final remark, I would say that this whole situation proves that the European Parliament needs full powers of inquiry with the right to summons witnesses, to hear them under oath, and to get access to confidential documents. Thank you.